All right, we are here today to talk about the Second World War. This is chapter 22nd, Fighting for the Four Freedoms. One of the most devastating wars in all of history of mankind. 50 to 70 million people died. Holocaust in Europe, another one in China. Countless civilians killed. Horrible, horrifying war. There were many events leading up to the Second World War. Japan invaded Manchuria, China in 1931. League of Nations did nothing to stop it. And again in 1937, the rest of China was invaded by the Japanese. Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935. They appealed to the world, appealed to the United Nations for support. None came. These countries were more focused on ending the Depression than dealing with Ethiopia and China being attacked. Spain had a civil war, and General Francisco Franco emerged victorious with the help of Hitler, who was able to send his new air force, the Luftwaffe, to test it out against the royalists. And Benito Mussolini also assisted with troops from Italy, and those fascist countries worked together in the Spanish Civil War. Adolf Hitler is going to send troops into the Rhineland to test the British and the French to see if they will stand up to him, and when they didn't, it opened the door for more further aggression. 1938, Hitler annexed Austria. 1939, he's going to take Czechoslovakia. Basically, it was given to him at the Munich conference. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain exclaimed, "Peace in our time." But it was only temporary. 6 months later, the rest of Czechoslovakia was taken, and within a year, Europe would be embroiled in the Second World War. And while this was happening, America maintained their isolationist stance. Americans opposed war because of anti-communism. If Germany is at war, that could be a check to communism. They wanted to protect their business interests, and they thought about the mistakes of fighting in the First World War. So Congress will pass neutrality acts in the 1930s, which banned traveling on ships that are at war, belligerent ships, and sending weapons overseas to countries in need. Hitler is going to sign a non-aggression pact with Stalin, and that opened the door for Germany's invasion of Poland, which was divided up between the two countries. And the Nazi blitzkrieg ran havoc and overran Europe in 1939 and 1940. Most of the countries in Europe will fall to the Nazis at that time. Roosevelt wanted to support the British and support countries for the cause of democracy. And Congress is going to approve a cash and carry plan for military rearmament to Britain. Roosevelt will run for a third term successfully, defeating Wendell Willkie. And the following year, 1941, December 7th, 1941, as Roosevelt said, a day that will live in infamy, Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese. Congress declared war the next day, and then Germany declared war on the United States. 2,400 Americans were killed at Pearl Harbor. Luckily for the American Navy, the four battleships happened to be out at sea that day and were not destroyed by the Japanese. But the damage was done: hundreds of airplanes, dozens of battleships. Here is a propaganda poster of to the Japanese. The goal was to dehumanize the enemy and convince Americans to fight against Japan, although it didn't take much convincing. Early in the war, the Japanese were incredibly successful. They're going to take Guam and the Philippines, other Pacific islands. The U.S. eventually turned the tide at the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway, where they're going to halt Japanese advances and start pushing the Japanese on the defensive. And the Americans employed an island hopping strategy. But it will take time. It won't be until 1945 that the Japanese will be forced to surrender. Meanwhile, the war in Europe, the British and the American forces defeated the Germans in North Africa, moved their way up into Sicily, into Italy. Joseph Stalin and the Russians pleaded with the Americans to open up a front in France to further divide the German army, but the Americans halted that until 1944. And that was the famous D-Day invasion on June 6th, which the Americans proved victorious. Here are some some of 13,000 American troops, along with 65,000 Filipinos, who were captured and forced on the Bataan Death March. Just an example of the extreme brutality employed by the Japanese. This is a map of World War II in Europe from 1942 to 45. We can see the extent of the German advance deep into the Soviet Union. The Battle of Stalingrad was a turning point where the Germans will start to be pushed back. That second front we talked about, where the Americans will hop onto Sicily and then up through Italy, and then D-Day was launched from Britain into France. So there'll be three ways of attacking the Germans. Over in the Pacific, the Americans employed an island hopping strategy, and the goal was to slowly maneuver their way closer to Japan so that they can engage in round-the-clock bombing. And once they were able to take Iwo Jima and Okinawa, which I don't see on this map, but they're close by, the Americans were able to bomb the Japanese repeatedly, again and again and again, and destroy most of their cities and their means of waging war. On the home front, the Office of War Information tried to portray the war as a people's fight for freedom against fascism and tyranny. Advertising firms urged Americans to buy war bonds so that the government would have money to fund the war and to take on other patriotic actions, to ration, to have watches here at home. Here's a propaganda poster comparing 78 and 1943. 78 was a down year for the Americans. Washington at Valley Forge. Women played an integral role in this war. Rosie the Riveter represented the strong, independent woman. Women were running the factories, making everything necessary for the war, and taking care of their families at home. Employers and unions saw women's work as temporary. It was a necessity for the wartime. Unfortunately for women, they were not working towards equal rights. That does not happen for some time. Here's an iconic image of a female labor operator in Texas. The Bracero program, 4.5 million Mexicans migrated to the United States to work. This lasted all the way until 1964. Increased tensions will result. Mexican-American rights were shown with the Zoot Suit riots, where hundreds of Mexicans were arrested, 150 were injured by Marines and sailors just because of their difference from the American culture. And the Japanese Americans living in the country, 2/3 of them were born in the United States. Most had never even been to Japan. But Executive Order 9066 is going to expel them from their homes. 110,000 citizens were locked up in internment camps. They lost their jobs, their ways of life, their homes, and only because they were Japanese. Fred Korematsu is going to sue behind the ACLU, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. He's a Japanese-American citizen, and he's going to lose. 1988, Congress gave $20,000 to any surviving Japanese Americans, but does not make up for the injustices done to them. Here's an image of a Japanese American family on their way to their internment camp. And the internment camps were located mainly in the West because the majority of the population lived in California. 1 million blacks served in the military. The birth of the civil rights movement grows from World War II. NAACP's membership rises considerably. And African Americans fought the Double V, not only a victory over the Axis powers, but also a victory over segregation in America. May 8th, 1945 is Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, a week before Hitler had killed himself, and Germany formally surrenders on that day. Attention was then turned to the Pacific to make Japan surrender. Brutal fighting in Guam and Philippines, well, not Guam, but in the Philippines, in Iwo Jima and Okinawa. July 1945, the first atomic bomb was detonated, and as a result of the secret Manhattan Project. And now the Americans had at their disposal nuclear weapons which the world had never seen. Here are some brave Marines landing on the beaches. Hiroshima was bombed on August 6th, and Nagasaki on August 9th, killing hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. and the war came to an end 5 days later. 20 million civilians died in World War II. Not just atomic bombs. We had fire bombings over Dresden, Germany, and Tokyo. 12 million died in the Holocaust. Um, Tens of millions died because of bombing campaigns in Europe and Asia. And there was a lot of criticism of the atomic bomb. It was debatable whether Truman actually needed to do it. Could the war have ended without the atomic bomb? Possibly. Was he doing it to show the Soviet Union? After the war, America was willing to use it if necessary, because this was the early beginnings of the Cold War. Here's some prisoners at a German concentration camp who, luckily for them, were liberated in 1945. This is the day after the detonation at Nagasaki. Post-war, at the Yalta Conference, back in 1943, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin all met, and the Soviet Union wished to control Eastern Europe. It was their armies that went into these countries and battled the Nazis. 20 million Russian soldiers died in the war. America lost 500,000. So what say did America have with the Soviet Union after they occupied these countries? That's the debate. Did Churchill not do and Roosevelt not do enough to stop Stalin? Did they really not have a say since Stalin was doing the dirty work? We'll talk about that in the Cold War. Communist governments will be established in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Albania. The eastern part of Europe will fall to communism. These countries were liberated by the Russians, and the Russians will not leave for 50 years. There's the big three: Stalin on the left, FDR in the middle, Winston Churchill on the right. After the war, the United Nations was created, consisted of a General Assembly where nations have an equal voice, and then a Security Council with 6 rotating members and 5 permanent: America, Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China, each with veto power over resolutions. And it's the job of the United Nations to stop wars from happening in the future. All right, that concludes World War II.